Thank you, Peter, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak. I feel slightly awkward with a card that says VIP, but I can tell you it's better than being called eminent. When you're eminent, it means you're getting very, very old. Just to explain my topic today, basically my background is in three areas, mainly as a farmer most of my life, but also as a scholar and, as Peter mentioned, as a senior public service and a chief of staff to various premiers around Australia. And I'm interested in the intersections between those three vocations, and in particular, if we posed it as a question, why it is that our exponential increase in knowledge about food security and the excellent practices on the ground struggle to convert themselves into public policy, and they are matters that yesterday Joel and Martin addressed. And I was very fortunate in Tasmania to be offered the position of Social Inclusion Commissioner, so I had a chance to at least start to ask how we might convert the ideas into the first food security state-level strategy in Australia. Again, just to set the scene, over the past 20 years, a number of us have pondered two public policy questions. The first public policy question is, how do we better engage, in particular, state and Commonwealth governments in food security? I don't think we have much of an issue with local government, and indeed, I think in the future, local government in conjunction with communities and small businesses will be the stewards of food security. We do have a problem engaging state and Commonwealth governments. The second question that we ponder is, how might we bring to scale and scope the very good learnings and capabilities of what we might call the community-based food security industry? And I note food banks talking shortly. I think food banks been caught in that dilemma for many, many years. In order to get to scale and scope, do you need to give up things about nimbleness and responsiveness and locality? And so the dilemma is that when you start to look at how you might institutionalise food security, you start to potentially move away from that focus on the local, the community, identity, trust, belonging, and so on, and you start to look like a government department, and you start to have things called policies and strategies and legislation and departments and ministers of state. And the dilemma is, without them, we keep bumping into them as obstacles, and with them we worry that we're becoming engaged with the very institutions that created most of the problems that we're trying to overcome, and that's the paradox. And so today's short presentation is really about what we tried to do in Tasmania. And it's not right or wrong or better or worse than anyone else has done. It was an attempt to say, how can we engage with the state government in particular, and with a focus very much, if you like, on the social aspects of food security. Need to point this somewhere. Okay. So why is food security so hard to organise? Some of the answers out on the board out in the front of the foyer, where there are lots of very interesting words about people's expectations, for example, around alternative economies. And one of the reasons that ministers and governments and parliaments are nervous about food security is it's very broad. And so the entry point shapes the way in which people think about it. And to some extent, it doesn't have a single focus. And it's that lack of a single focus that creates a problem for governments. And in particular, governments are very risk averse. And I've, over the past 20 years, spoken with many ministers and premiers. In fact, in Victoria, we tried to get food security on the COAG agenda in the early 2000s and failed dismally. Because as soon as we put up a proposal that started off with the notion of food security, it raised these big issues: land ownership, genetically modified crops, a whole lot of debates that government shied away from. And so food security, and that's the bottom point here, is in what I call the nursery. So things in public policy that are in the nursery don't quite grow up to be a big government department with a minister. They hang off the side of other departments, so sport and recreation, youth, for example. In recent years, the only new big department that's popped up out of the nursery instantly is, of course, security, but not security in the sense that we talk about it. And so food security sits on the margins of public policy in terms of the way in which it's organised. And that's that dilemma. Would we be better off having a Minister for Food Security or not? So I'm just noting that we start off when we talk about the public policy of food security with a whole lot of uncertainty and tension. And yet there are multiple mandates. And I draw the distinction between a mandate and an authorising environment. A mandate is a compelling reason to act. An authorising environment is whether you can marshal the capability to actually act. And in fact, we struggle in Australia to do that. We struggle to marshal the authorising environment in which to move beyond essentially a cottage industry approach. So basically, what we proposed in Tasmania was to look at a framework within which we could bracket off many of the broader issues and at least test the proposition of how would food security be organised if it was focused on a particular social risk issue, and that was the risk of food insecurity. And so the strategy, the social inclusion strategy that I drafted in 2009 talked about the importance of food security in Tasmania. In particular, it talked about the importance of food security for children. I often use children as an example because it's harder to moralise about why children shouldn't be fed. You can always justify that adults don't deserve food because they've done something silly or wrong. It's much harder to justify why children ought not have access to nutritious, culturally appropriate, accessible, high-quality food. And so in our strategy, we also built in the notion of the importance of local community food systems and the notion of having extensive coalitions to drive the process. We had quite a lot of knowledge, contextual knowledge. Most important one, the cost of living strategy. Basically, I said to the then Premier of the time, David Bartlett, how can we claim to be the food bowl of Australia if we can't feed our children? And that, I think, got to him. I think he sort of understood then there was a compelling reason to think about food security. We set up a council. Again, its purpose was to simply identify a strategy and begin some early actions. It was time limited. It was very much an informal group of people. It wasn't a statutory entity, so it was fairly easy to set up. Its purpose was to make recommendations to the Premier about local food security issues. And it took very much what we would call a democratic approach to how it would operate. And the membership was basically a cross-section of people interested in the social policy side of food security. So it excluded my colleagues, the farmers, it excluded big industry, and that created considerable angst politically and in the media. And that was a deliberate decision in order to manage the focus of the Food Security Council. It was a deliberate decision not to involve the full range of what we might call institutional stakeholders. So basically, we set up a fund, and in the end it ended up being about 3.5 million over 3 years, so it's quite a reasonable amount of money for Tasmania. And basically what we were looking at was innovation, we were looking at coalitions, and we were looking at responses that would also build our knowledge. So we had very much a focus on action, a focus on strategy, and a focus on learning. Now, most of this is available in written form as a summary of the debate, if people would like, as well as the slides. going through because of time. So then there were a series, so basically we ended up with 8 coalitions representing over 40 organisations. The logic of having a strategy based on coalitions was to try and build the cumulative capacity of knowledge rather than having it constantly fragmented. So the idea was that if we could get community groups working with businesses, working with local government, working with state and Commonwealth government, then the sum of the parts would be, the whole would be greater than the sum of the parts. It took a lot of organising and a lot of effort from community groups, governments and businesses to create the coalitions, but in the end we had a lot of very good applications and were able to get some very good strategies on the ground. And again, it was that logic of building up capability, that notion of scale and scope. So scale being volume and scope, if you like, being reach. So could we actually build scale and scope through this community-based cumulative network strategy was really one of the threshold questions that we asked. Now I won't, today here, and I think yesterday, Sandra Murray, Alison Ward, Leah Galvin were 3 people centrally involved in Tasmania and all have presentations, and I think Leah has one later this morning. And they're talking about some of the projects that were funded and some of the outcomes from them. So I'm just going to skip through, but this gives you some vignettes of the sorts of projects that we funded. And again, I should note in passing that I've been a critic over time of the notion of pilots and endless short-term projects. In fact, one of my sayings is more pilots than Qantas and more visions than Mother Teresa. And that's because we often simply keep doing little things and we don't learn from them, and in particular we don't learn to scale and scope them. And so we're trying in this approach to work out how, with all the projects, we could bring that knowledge together to look at what the scale and scope might look like if they were built up. So these are some of the activities. Let's just skip back to the Glenorchy. Again, one of the key points I'm making about public policy is if we're going to engage the public sector and our parliaments and our governments, it's got to have this mixture of pragmatism, strategy and learning. And it's that mixture of being able to cut ribbons but also be able to contribute to long-term understanding and change. I just want to draw a couple of observations that came out of our research. One of the first things we understood back a bit. So one of the first things we understood, and we seem to have lost a slide here, so I'll go back again. No. One of the, is that, and this is another field in which I write quite extensively, and that is that we've lost a lot of our old communities, the old place-based communities like parishes and wards and things like that, which we no longer talk about. They're being replaced by these virtual communities. One of our challenges, particularly with physical place-based strategies such as food security, is how do we make sense of what does food security look like in a world where communities are virtual as distinct from spatial, place-based? What does that mean in terms of access, understanding? That's, I think, a threshold question that's unresolved, but it's an important one for the food security field. So definitely struggling here with So one of the things that happens with cities is they creep out. This is just a shot from Launceston, and this is the distance that people travel to go in to spend time and money in the city. Why does this matter? It matters because around Australia this is the same pattern, that cities, partly because of agglomeration, but which means they can have a massive things, and because of better transport, faster transport, safer transport, more expensive transport, nevertheless, people travel great distances. What does that mean? through. What it means, and it was a slide that we just skipped through, is that we've created a lot of what we call food deserts. Food deserts are small towns, usually on the peri-urban sites of cities, so within 40, 50 k's of cities, where basically the little corner shop and the little supermarket have all closed and people have to travel to the regional centres or the cities to access food. What it means is that often in those prime agricultural areas, you have the highest rates of food insecurity. In particular for people with poor access to poor transport options, then they have food deserts, poor quality, high cost, culturally inappropriate, difficult to access food. And that's something that we never really expected to find. And they, of course, associate with the most disadvantaged areas. And this is a pattern throughout Australia. And given the recent finding on poverty, and so one of the long-term solutions to this, and this is what we've tried to do in Tasmania, is to go back to that notion of how do you build local food systems? How do you build local food systems that might be able to offset in particular risks associated with spatially distributed high levels of inequality? Now you're all quite familiar with this, but the question of course is what do you actually need to do? And this is partly what we're trying to do in Tasmania, as many others are, but the question is how do you build it to scale and to scope? So why does it all matter? Why does this all matter? And it matters because at the end of the day, local food systems do have the potential, if brought to scale and scope, to address high levels of food insecurity. They also have the ability to revitalise communities. The connection between food security and the growth of our reservoir of social capital is quite significant. And one of the things we did in Tassie was to promote community gardens endlessly. I'm not actually a great fan of them, but it works in terms of a model because we're able to show, and this is quite an important slide, we're able to show that community gardens are not just about food in the narrow sense. And so we presented this narrative that community gardens are actually about social capital, economic capital, environmental capital, and human capital. So we added up 20 qualifications, for example, that people could get working in a community garden. Now that was an attempt to change the narrative around from a focus on food itself to a focus on the various types of value that are created that are of interest to public policy makers and communities. So not just social capital, but economic capital, environmental capital, and human capital. And it's quite a different way to present the food security argument. Now we're still in the early days, but certainly if there was any advice I would give, that is that if you can't do that, then you're always going to be facing challenges promoting food security. Oops, still. Oh. Just some quick evidence. Again, one of the arguments about how do you get public policy that matters, have quick, simple presentations that show changes in important outcomes for children. Short-term, fairly significant impact, easy to present, quite powerful. So, just to summarise, a set of learnings first of all about food security, but in relation to policy and politics. If you want to get a strategy that actually works at state government level, it does need to be focused. I don't think you've got any chance of getting up a food security strategy that tries to take all issues on board. Be clear on the mandate and authorising environment, mix the research and action and ribbon cutting, have good local evidence, visualisation stories, manage the boundary creep issue that create risk and uncertainty. For example, don't get too much into land use planning and urban design or you can run into a whole set of other issues. align with matters of significance to parliaments and governments, in our case with cost of living, be careful of mission drift. And I put that in because, importantly, this can somehow look as a cop-out, a sell-out to food security in order to get something happening. But in that context, things can happen. And so to summarise our learnings about food security, first of all, there is extensive local capability in Australia, but it's still not well organised to scale or scope, but it's not clear whether scaling and scoping it up is the right way to go. It's not clear at what point that local nimbleness and responsiveness and flexibility and community orientation turns into an ossified bureaucracy. And that's a dilemma that we all constantly face. Most of the energy and motivation in Australia is coming from the local. It's coming from local communities, rarely from state and Commonwealth governments. There's extensive local knowledge about food security in Australia, a lot of which is local and a lot of which doesn't usually get into the mainstream of state and Commonwealth governments. It is possible to tackle food security at multiple levels without trying to do everything at once and scaring people off. Collaborative social enterprises, which is what we did in Tasmania, are one key to sustainability of local food systems. At the end of the day, land use planning is absolutely critical, and the nature of settlements and their relationship with their hinterlands and the food supply and food value chain. And at the end of the day, local government, I think in Australia, local government as an institution, not necessarily your particular local council, but local government as an institution is the only entity that I think can pull this together and operate both at the local level but to the scale and scope to convert the ideas about food rights into food reality. Thank you.